I love you, Emily.
Love you too.
Your own wife and she vanishes. My neighbor Joe shouted from the hall, "Rough day?" I said, "Long one." He laughed, "Go hug your wife." I smiled and unlocked our apartment. Emily's voice drifted from the bedroom, laughing. I said, "That laugh always saves me." I kicked off my shoes and called, "Em, guess what happened at work?" Silence, then a softer laugh. I froze. Yesterday morning Emily had said, "You work too hard, Logan." I answered, "I'm building us a future." She touched my face. Our future. That word had carried me through the whole day. At work my boss Mark told me, "Promotion is coming if you keep this up." I said, "My wife's going to cry." He joked, "Your friend Ryan will throw a party." Ryan always did. Ryan Brooks had been my best friend since I was 9. When my dad left, Ryan said, "You're my brother now." When I met Emily at college, Ryan whispered, "She's the one, man." When I proposed, Ryan filmed the whole thing and yelled, "Legend." He toasted at our wedding, "To Logan, the luckiest guy alive." I believed him. I believed both of them. That night over dinner Emily said, "Someday we'll buy a house." I said, "White porch, big window, blue door." She smiled, "2 kids." I added, "A dog." She laughed, "You always win." Ryan texted me, "Game night Friday?" I replied, "Always." Emily leaned on my shoulder and whispered, "I love our life." I said, "Me too." I meant it with everything in me. Back in the apartment hallway I called again, "Emily?" Her laughter floated out, light and secret. My phone buzzed. Ryan's name. He wrote, "You busy?" I typed, "Just got home." 3 dots appeared then vanished. I said out loud, "That's weird." Earlier that week Emily had told me, "Ryan's helping me plan your birthday." I joked, "Should I be scared?" She said, "Very." Ryan later said, "Trust me." I always did. Trusting them was as easy as breathing. I walked to the bedroom and knocked. I said, "Hey, I'm home." The laughter stopped. Emily called, "1 minute." I leaned on the wall and smiled, thinking of the house, the porch, the kids, the dog, the future. I said, "Take your time." Inside, a man's voice murmured something. Sounded like Ryan. My stomach tightened. I whispered, "No." The lock clicked. "Not open." Lock. I pressed my palm to the door and said, "Emily?" She answered too fast, "I'm changing." I said, "You don't lock the door." Silence. Then that soft laugh again. I stepped back. My chest hurt. I told myself, "Relax, Logan." I told myself, "They love you." I told myself, "This is nothing." But something inside me began to break and I did not know why. I remembered a night when Ryan said, "If anything ever happens, I've got your back." I had answered, "Always." Emily had raised her glass and said, "To the 3 of us." Ryan joked, "Best team." Emily laughed, "Unbreakable." Those words echoed now. I paced the hall and said, "Em, open the door." She replied, "Just a second." I said, "We have leftovers waiting." She said, "I'm not hungry." I forced a laugh. "Since when?" No answer. My phone buzzed again. Ryan wrote, "Call me later." I whispered, "Why later?" I typed, "Now." No reply. I leaned against the wall and spoke to the empty room, "I love you, Emily." Behind the door she said softly, "Love you too." That should have calmed me. It didn't. I said, "Did you finish the list for the house?" She said, "We'll talk later." I said, "Okay." My voice shook. I told myself, "Don't ruin a good night." I told myself, "You're paranoid." I told myself, "You're lucky." But the laughter, the lock, the silence, the phone, they circled my mind. I looked at the wedding photo on the wall and said, "We're okay." The door stayed closed. I waited. I listened. And something in me kept cracking. I said, "Emily, we need to talk." Emily looked up from the couch and smiled. "About what?" I said, "About last night." Emily said, "What about it?" I said, "You were distant. You locked the door." Emily laughed softly. "Logan, you're imagining things." I said, "I heard another voice." Emily said, "You're tired? You've been working non-stop." I said, "That wasn't in my head." Emily reached for my hand. "You're scaring yourself." I pulled back. "Why won't you look at me?" Emily said, "I am looking at you." I said, "Not really." Emily crossed her arms. "You're being dramatic." I said, "I just want the truth." Emily said, The truth is you're overthinking. I whispered, then why does everything feel wrong? Emily replied, because you don't trust yourself. My phone buzzed. Ryan's name. I answered, what's up? Ryan laughed. You sound stressed. I said, Emily's been acting strange. Ryan said, you're paranoid, brother? I said, I heard something. Ryan replied, you always hear things when you're tired. I said, so you're saying I'm crazy? Ryan said, I'm saying you need sleep. I went back inside. I said, Ryan thinks I'm imagining it. Emily nodded. Ryan's right. I said, why are you both saying the same thing? Emily said, because it's true. I said, or because you planned it. Emily's smile froze. What? I said, nothing. Emily exhaled. You're hurting yourself. I touched my wedding ring. The metal felt heavy. I said, this doesn't feel the same anymore. Emily looked at my hand. It's just a ring. I said, it used to feel like everything. Emily said, you're being emotional. I said, I'm being honest. Emily stood. I have to shower. I said, we're not done. Emily replied, we are for now. I sat alone and stared at the ring. I said out loud, why does it feel like a weight? The room stayed silent. My mind argued with itself. I told myself, she loves me. Another voice said, something's wrong. I whispered, trust her. Then I whispered, protect yourself. Ryan called again. He said, everything good? I said, I don't know. Ryan replied, you worry too much. I said, what if I'm not wrong? Ryan said, you are. I asked, promise? Ryan laughed. Always. Emily came out of the bathroom. She said, I'm going to bed. I said, talk to me. Emily said, tomorrow? I said, you said that yesterday. Emily looked away. I'm tired. I said, so am I. Emily walked past me. The door closed. I stayed on the couch. The ring kept pressing into my skin. I whispered, what's happening to us? My phone buzzed again. Emily's phone buzzed too. The room was dark except for the glow from her screen. 2:17 a.m. Ryan's name lit up her phone. My chest tightened. My hands shook. I didn't move. I just stared. I followed Emily's car without turning on my headlights. I whispered, please don't be real. Emily's phone had buzzed again after midnight and Emily had said, I'm just going for a walk. I said, at 1 a.m? Emily replied, I need air. I said, I'll come. Emily said, no, that word cut. Now I was here, parked across from Ryan's building, watching Emily's car slide into Ryan's spot. My hands shook on the wheel. I said, this isn't happening. I stepped out into the cold. I called Ryan. Where are you? Ryan answered, home. I said, alone? Ryan laughed. Why? I said, just asking. Ryan said, you worry too much. I hung up and walked to the entrance. The hallway smelled like paint and old carpet. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stood outside Ryan's apartment door. I said, open it. No one answered. Then I heard Emily's laugh. Soft, private. The kind of laugh Emily only used with me. I pressed my forehead to the door. My stomach twisted. I heard Ryan say, we shouldn't. Emily replied, it's too late. I whispered, stop. Ryan said, what about Logan? Emily said, Logan doesn't understand me. Ryan said, I'm here. Emily said, I know. My vision blurred. I tasted metal in my mouth. I said, this is a nightmare. I wanted to knock. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break the door. I stayed still. I listened. Ryan said, you're shaking. Emily said, I'm scared. Ryan said, I've got you. I felt something tear inside me. I turned away. I walked down the stairs. I stepped into the rain. The rain soaked my jacket. I didn't care. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I said, I trusted you. The street was empty. Cars passed. I started walking with no direction. My phone rang. Emily's name. I stared at it. I didn't answer. It rang again. I said, don't. Ryan called. I answered. Ryan said, where are you? I said, don't lie. Ryan said, what? I said, I heard you. Ryan said, you're imagining things. I said, I heard Emily's voice. Ryan said, Logan, calm down. I said, you destroyed me. Ryan said, you're overreacting. I said, don't call me again. I ended the call. The rain got heavier. My shoes filled with water. I kept walking. I whispered, I gave you everything. I remembered Ryan saying, brothers for life. I remembered Emily saying, forever. I laughed once. It sounded broken. My phone buzzed again. Emily texted, where are you? I typed, outside. Emily replied, come home. I wrote, why? Emily sent, we need to talk. I wrote, I heard you. Emily stopped replying. I sat on a bus stop bench. The rain dripped off my hair. I stared at my hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. My chest felt hollow. I waited for tears. None came. I felt nothing. I said, I'm empty. A stranger asked, you okay? I said, no. The stranger nodded. Yeah. My phone buzzed again. Ryan texted, you're making a mistake. I typed, so did you. I blocked the number. I blocked Emily's number too. My hands felt cold. My heart felt distant. I stood and walked. The city lights blurred. I crossed streets without looking. I didn't care. I said, it's over. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. I was numb. I reached the river. I leaned on the railing. The rain hit the water and vanished. I whispered, goodbye. My phone vibrated once more. I didn't check it. I turned and walked away from everything I thought I was, from the life I believed in, from the people I loved, from the future I had built in my head. I kept walking until the sky began to fade from black to gray. My hands finally stopped shaking. My thoughts slowed. My heart stayed empty. I said, this is the end. And I kept going. Emily stood by the door with 2 suitcases and said, I need space. I said, from me? Emily replied, from everything. I said, you're leaving? Emily said, for now. I whispered, you already left. Emily looked down. Logan, please don't make this harder. I said, you made this. Emily opened the door and walked out. I texted Ryan, we need to talk. No reply. I called Ryan. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I said, coward. 2 days later my brother Daniel knocked. Daniel said, you look like hell. I said, come in. Daniel sat and said, I know. I said, you don't. Daniel said, everyone knows. I said, about what? Daniel leaned forward. About Emily and Ryan. I stood. Stop. Daniel said, you saw them. I whispered, I heard them. Daniel said, then you know. I shook my head. I don't want to. Daniel said, you need to. I said, they were my world. Daniel said, they destroyed it. I said, maybe it's my fault. Daniel slammed the table. No. I flinched. Daniel said, don't you dare blame yourself. I sat down. At work my boss Mark called me in. Mark said, you missed 3 deadlines. I said, I'm trying. Mark said, you haven't been here. I said, I am here. Mark said, not mentally. I said, I just need time. Mark shook his head. We already gave you time. I whispered, please? Mark sighed. We're letting you go. I stared at the floor. Mark said, I'm sorry. I nodded and walked out. That night I sat in the dark. Daniel called. Daniel said, how are you holding up? I said, I lost my job. Daniel went silent. Daniel said, come stay with me. I said, no. Daniel said, you shouldn't be alone. I said, I already am. Days blurred. I stopped sleeping. When I closed my eyes I heard Emily's laugh and Ryan's voice. I whispered, make it stop. It never did. I checked my phone every hour. No messages. No calls. I said, they erased me. One night I called Emily. Emily answered, what? I said, do you miss me? Emily said, Logan, don't. I said, did you ever love me? Emily paused. Emily said, I have to go. The line went dead. I called Ryan. Ryan finally answered. I said, say something. Ryan said, you should move on. I laughed. That's it. Ryan said, I didn't plan for this. I said, you still chose it. Ryan whispered, I'm sorry. I said, that word is empty. I hung up. I stopped eating. I stopped shaving. I stopped caring. The mirror showed someone I didn't know. I said, who are you? The reflection didn't answer. Daniel came again. Daniel said, you're disappearing. I said, good. Daniel said, you don't mean that. I said, I don't feel anything. Daniel grabbed my shoulders. You matter. I whispered, not anymore. Daniel said, this isn't the end. I said, it feels like it. That night I sat on the floor and stared at my wedding ring. I said, everything is gone. I pressed the ring to my chest. I said, I'm tired. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. For a moment I wondered if waking up was worth it. I walked into the old office building because I had nowhere else to go. I said, just don't fall apart in public. The elevator opened and Maya stood there holding coffee. Maya said, Logan? I froze. Maya said, it's been years. I said, yeah. Maya studied my face. You look tired. I said, that's one word for it. Maya stepped aside. Come with me. I followed. We sat in the break room. Maya pushed the coffee toward me. Drink. I said, I don't deserve it. Maya said, drink anyway. I drank. Maya said, what happened? I shrugged. Everything. Maya waited. I said, Emily left. Ryan betrayed me. I lost my job. I don't sleep. I barely eat. Maya said nothing. I said, you can say something. Maya said, I'm listening. My chest tightened. I said, why? Maya replied, because someone should. I stared at the table. I said, I'm not the man I used to be. Maya said, good. I looked up. What? Maya said, that man trusted the wrong people. This man gets a chance to choose again. I whispered, I don't know how. Maya leaned forward. Start by not destroying yourself. I laughed once. That's all I've been doing. Maya said, then stop. I said, I don't know how. Maya said, stay. Later that day I walked out of the building with Maya. Maya said, you still talk to Nathan? I said, not in years. Maya smiled. Call Nathan. I said, why? Maya said, because Nathan respects you. I shook my head. Not anymore. Maya said, try. I called Nathan. Nathan answered, Logan? I said, it's me. Nathan said, I heard about the job. I said, yeah. Nathan said, you okay? I said, no. Nathan said, come by tomorrow. I said, why? Nathan said, because you're not done. The next morning I stood outside Nathan's office. My hand shook. I said, don't run. I went in. Nathan looked up. Sit. I sat. Nathan said, tell me the truth. I said, I broke. Nathan nodded. Good. I blinked. Good? Nathan said, now we can rebuild. I swallowed. I don't have anything left. Nathan said, you have yourself. Days turned into weeks. I worked under Nathan. I showed up early. I stayed late. Maya checked on me. Maya said, did you eat? I said, yes. Maya said, did you sleep? I said, some. Maya smiled. Progress. One night I sat alone and said, you can keep dying or you can live. I stared at my reflection. I said, choose. My chest felt heavy. My head felt clear for the first time in months. I whispered, I choose me. I called Daniel. Daniel said, you sound different. I said, I am. Daniel said, proud of you. I walked into work the next morning and said, I'm still here. Nathan nodded. Good. Maya waved. Hey. I waved back. Hey. That night I lay in bed and felt the weight lift a little. I said, I'm not done. I closed my eyes. For the first time since everything shattered, I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to survive. Months passed and I realized I hadn't checked my phone for Emily or Ryan in days. I whispered, good. I rebuilt my mornings. I said to Nathan, I'm ready. Nathan nodded. I knew you would be. I stayed late, worked harder, pushed myself. I said, I will not break again. Maya walked by and said, looking sharper. I smiled faintly. Feels good to be me again. At lunch, a coworker whispered, did you hear about Ryan's company? I raised an eyebrow. What? The coworker said, rumors, he's losing clients fast. I sipped my coffee slowly. Interesting. I didn't say more. I passed Emily on the street once. She waved weakly. I said nothing. She looked tired, her makeup smudged. I said, she looks worn out. I kept walking. Back at my apartment, I reviewed plans for a new project. I muttered, time to move forward. Maya called. Dinner? I said, sure. I watched her eyes and felt calm. One morning Nathan said, you've improved a lot. I shrugged. Feels like years of work in months. Nathan said, it's dedication. I smiled. I needed that. I overheard clients mention Ryan's name. He's scrambling, one said. I kept my expression neutral. I whispered, karma. Emily called me once. I ignored it. Another time she texted, can we talk? I didn't reply. I said, not my problem anymore. At work a new deal came in. Nathan said, Logan, handle this. I said, consider it done. I felt control power returning. I whispered, this is mine now. Maya said, you seem different. I said, stronger. She smiled. Good for you. I thought of the nights I cried, the nights I felt empty. I whispered, gone? I checked news online. Ryan's company was bleeding money. I said, finally. Emily's posts looked curated, exhausted, pretending everything was fine. I whispered, keep pretending. At night I reviewed my goals aloud. Focus. Move forward. Build. Maya texted, proud of you. I smiled at my phone. I whispered, thank you. Every step I took reminded me of what I lost and what I gained. I said, I'm not the same man who trusted blindly. I said, I control my life now. Months of pain had shaped me. I felt calm, calculating. I watched silently as their lives shifted. Karma was moving quietly and I didn't need to interfere. I said, let it come. I leaned back in my chair, chest heavy but steady. I whispered, this is just the beginning. My phone buzzed. Ryan Brooks. I stared at the screen. I whispered, why now? I answered, Logan. Ryan's voice sounded nervous. I said, you called me. Ryan said, I need help. I laughed once. You? Ryan said, business is falling apart. I said, finally. Ryan said, it's serious. I don't know who to turn to. I said, you're calling me? Ryan said, you have connections. You can fix things. I said, I fixed myself first. Later that afternoon Ryan came to my office. I said, you look desperate. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. I am. I said, funny how that feels familiar. Ryan said, I know I screwed up. I need you, Logan. I said, you needed me before too in other ways. Ryan swallowed. I know. I'm sorry. Then Emily walked in behind him. She looked pale, her hand on her stomach. I said, Emily. Emily said, hi. Ryan said, she's pregnant. I felt my chest tighten. I said, congratulations? Emily said, it's complicated. I said, complicated how? Emily said, Ryan doubts it's his. I stared at Ryan. Ryan said, I don't know. I can't tell. I said, unbelievable. Emily said, we need your help, Logan. I laughed bitterly. After everything? Ryan said, please? Business is collapsing. I can't go to anyone else. I said, and you thought I'd just help? Emily said, you're the only one we trust. I said, trust is tricky with you too. Ryan said, I know I ruined it. I said, you did. We sat in my office. Ryan said, I need introductions, Logan. Investors, clients? I said, you know I can help. Emily said, please, Logan. I closed my eyes. I whispered, this is what betrayal feels like again. Ryan said, I understand if you hate me. I said, hate is easy. But I still know how to fix things. Emily said softly, Logan, I need you. I said, you don't know what that does to me. Ryan said, I'm desperate. I said, so am I sometimes. Emily looked down. We don't want to hurt you. I said, you already did. Ryan said, we'll follow your rules. I said, I make the calls. You listen. Understand? Ryan nodded. Emily nodded. I whispered, I hate that I care. I set up meetings, made calls, contacted investors. Ryan kept checking his phone nervously. Emily sat silently, hands folded. I said, you look tired. Emily said, I am. I said, both of you look fragile. Ryan said, fragile doesn't work in business. I said, fragile gets people killed in life too. Hours passed. I watched their eyes shift from hope to doubt. I said, you two need me, but do you deserve me? Ryan said, we made mistakes. I said, you made me. Emily whispered, I know. I said, don't make me soft. I'm already tempted. I spent the evening rebuilding contacts. I said, Logan Carter always delivers. Ryan muttered, I forgot how capable you are. I said, that's the point. Emily said, we're sorry? I said, sorry doesn't pay bills, Ryan. Ryan nodded. Later, I leaned back and whispered, old wounds reopen for a reason. Emily asked, will you forgive us? I said, not yet. But I'll work with you. Ryan said, thank you. I said, don't thank me. Just survive. As they left, I stared at the door. I whispered, helping them hurts me, but I'm still the only one who can. I shook my head. And I will. Because I choose survival, not revenge, this time. I stared at the ceiling and whispered, do I forgive them or destroy them? The question had haunted me for months. Maya Lewis walked in holding a cup of coffee. Thinking too hard? She asked. I said, always. Maya sat across from me. You can't lose yourself, Logan. I said, I already lost everything once. Maya said, don't let it happen again. I looked at her. It's tempting. Later, I met Rachel Bennett at her office. I said, I need protection, not revenge. Rachel said, good. Revenge clouds judgment. I said, I want control, not chaos. Rachel nodded. We'll secure everything. Assets, accounts, legal options. I said, make it bulletproof. Rachel smiled faintly. That's my job. Back at my apartment, I replayed Emily and Ryan's faces. I whispered, they need me, but do I need them? Maya called. Dinner? I said, not hungry. Maya said, eat anyway. Think clearly. I sighed. Fine. Over dinner, Maya asked, what do you feel? I said, I feel everything, at once. Maya said, anger? I said, yes. Maya said, forgiveness? I said, I'm trying. Maya reached across the table. Calm control is stronger than rage. I said, I want to believe that. The next morning, Rachel sent updates. Accounts are secure. Legal protections in place. I said, perfect. Rachel said, you've kept your cool. That's rare. I said, I've learned from mistakes. Rachel said, mistakes teach more than revenge ever could. I said, maybe you're right. I stood by the window watching the city wake. I whispered, revenge is a trap. Maya leaned against the doorframe. And forgiveness is freedom. I said, I want freedom. Maya smiled. Then you already have it. I received a text from Ryan Brooks. Thank you, Logan. I stared at it. I could call back. I could yell. I could demand apologies. I typed nothing. I deleted it. I whispered, silence is power. Emily Carter's social media showed exhaustion. I said, they're struggling again. Maya said, you don't have to interfere emotionally. I said, I won't. Calm control, remember? Maya nodded. Good. You're mastering yourself. At night, I sat in my chair and said aloud, I choose myself first. My phone buzzed. Rachel texted, everything is secure. I smiled faintly. Thank you. Maya said, you're ready for anything now. I said, I am. Strong, calm, focused. I leaned back, fingers interlaced, heart steady. I whispered, I won't let rage take me. I won't let betrayal define me. Maya said, this is the real power. I said, finally I understand. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. I said, control over myself, that's victory. The moral war inside me quieted, leaving a stillness I hadn't known since the world collapsed around me. I checked my phone and saw the news. Ryan Brooks' company had filed for bankruptcy. I whispered, finally. Maya Lewis leaned over my shoulder. Are you going to gloat? I said, no. I'm just watching karma unfold. Ryan called. I didn't answer. A text followed, Logan, I need advice. I laughed softly. Advice. I muttered. I ignored it. Later, Marcus, Ryan's right-hand man, appeared at my office. I said, Marcus, what brings you here? Marcus looked nervous. It's Ryan, he's lost everything. I don't know what to do. I said, and why come to me? Marcus swallowed. I can't trust him anymore. I need your help. I raised an eyebrow. Funny how quickly loyalty disappears when the tide turns. Marcus said nothing. I said, you'll find out what it's like to be on the other side. Emily Carter called. Her voice trembled. Logan, I don't know what to do. I said, do you really need me? Emily whispered, I just feel lost. Ryan, he never loved me like you did. My chest tightened. Now you understand. Emily paused. Everything is falling apart. I said, I told you eventually the truth comes out. That evening Sophia called. I didn't recognize the tone in her voice. Logan, I have to tell you something. I said, go ahead. Sophia said, I lied. About everything. About what I told you before. I hid the truth because I was scared. I said, why now? Sophia said, because you're the only one I trust. I can't carry this anymore. I listened quietly. My heartbeat slowed. Good. Now it's out. The next day the office was chaos. Ryan's employees left in droves. Investors pulled funds. Marcus texted me, it's worse than I thought. I replied, told you. I watched quietly as the empire Ryan built crumbled. Emily posted on social media. Her posts tried to appear strong, but the exhaustion was visible. I whispered, pretend all you want, the cracks show. At lunch Marcus met me again. Logan, I never realized how much you handled for Ryan. He doesn't deserve anyone like you. I said, welcome to reality. Marcus nodded silently. Ryan's calls grew frantic. I ignored them all. Emily sent texts pleading for advice. I deleted them. I said, no more saving the people who broke me. Later, Sophia appeared in person. Tears in her eyes, she said, I'm sorry for hiding the truth. You deserved better. I said, you're finally honest. That's all I need. By evening, Ryan's office was empty. News cameras showed his bankruptcy publicly. Emily's exhaustion was reported. Marcus' betrayal made headlines. Their world crumbled visibly, painfully, publicly. I whispered, this is what happens when you betray the ones who truly care. I sat back in my chair, chest heavy but steady. Maya said softly, are you satisfied? I said, no. I'm calm. I'm just observing. I checked my reflection in the window. I said, I could destroy them completely. But I won't. Let them feel their own consequences. Let them live with it. Silence filled the room. I whispered, this is their fall. I rise above. Maya nodded. The right way. I said, finally balance. And for the first time in years I felt untouchable. The knock at my door was soft but insistent. I called, who is it? Emily Carter's voice trembled. Logan, please, can we talk? I didn't answer immediately. My chest tightened. I whispered, finally. The door opened and Emily stepped inside. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged, hand clutching her bag. Logan. I held up a hand. Stop. Don't start with excuses. She swallowed. I'm sorry. I need you. I made a mistake. I said nothing. My silence filled the room. She took a step closer. I can't live like this. Please take me back. I looked at her, her desperation clear, and whispered, you had your chance. You lost it. Emily shook her head, tears spilling. I was blind. I didn't realize what I had. I said, and now? I know. I know now. Her voice broke. Ryan, everything he did. I should have seen it. I said, and yet you didn't. She dropped to her knees. Please, please, Logan. I leaned back, crossing my arms. No, not this time. Not ever. Ryan Brooks appeared behind her, slumping against the doorway. Logan. I admit it. I destroyed everything. I was wrong. I cut him off. You broke the only people who ever mattered, Ryan. And you have no one left. Ryan lowered his gaze. I know. Emily pleaded again. I need you. I'm pregnant. I made mistakes, but I need you. I said, do you think I care about who needs me now? I cared once. That man is gone. Emily's lips quivered. But I love you, I said. Love is nothing when trust is gone. Ryan whispered, I was foolish. I let greed and pride ruin everything. Logan. I'm sorry. I said, sorry doesn't fix broken lives. Sorry doesn't erase betrayal. Ryan's shoulders slumped. I know. Emily fell to the floor, head in hands. Logan, you don't understand, I said. I do. I understand completely. You destroyed what I cherished most, and now, you live with it. She looked up, eyes pleading. I'll do anything, just take me back. I said, no. I won't. Emily shook violently. Please. I'm begging. I whispered, beg all you want. I'm not the man who trusted you blindly anymore. Ryan muttered, I never thought it would end like this. I said, neither did I. But I learned something far more important. Emily's tears fell faster. What? I said, that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Emily whispered, I understand, maybe too late. I said, too late. And now you feel what it's like to lose someone who truly cared. That's your regret. Ryan nodded silently, shame etched across his face. Emily's hands trembled. I can't change what I did. I said, no you can't. You can only live with it. I watched them, feeling neither pleasure nor pain. Just calm. Just control. I whispered, the man you broke no longer exists. And I am finally free. They left my apartment quietly, defeated. I closed the door and exhaled slowly. I said aloud, let them feel it. Let them live with regret. I won't. I have my life back. For the first time in years I smiled. Not cruelly. Not happily. Calmly. Peacefully. The man they betrayed had risen. The knock on my door was hesitant. I didn't need to ask who it was. Emily Carter. Ryan Brooks. Again. I whispered, here we go one last time. I opened the door slightly. Emily's eyes were red, swollen. Ryan looked defeated, shoulders slumped. Logan, please, Emily said softly. I need you. I stepped back, crossing my arms. You already had me. You broke me. Emily's lip quivered. I know, but I cut her off. No, not this time. Ryan Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Logan, I can't fix anything without you. I shook my head slowly. You think I'm the crutch that holds your lives together? I'm not. Ryan's eyes widened. We've lost everything. Please just, I said, no. Emily whispered, I made mistakes. I was blind. I know now. I want to make it right. I said calmly, you can't make it right with me. Not anymore. Ryan said, we're begging Logan. We need your help. I said, you don't need me. You needed me when you betrayed me. That's done. Emily dropped her gaze, hands shaking. I thought I loved you. I said, you loved what I gave you, not me. You loved control, comfort, not the man who trusted you completely. She whispered, I understand, maybe too late. I said, exactly. Too late. Ryan's voice cracked. I never realized what I had. Logan. I destroyed it all. I said, and you have no one to blame but yourself. Emily said quietly, please, forgive us? I shook my head. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. You'll live with your own consequences. They exchanged looks, shame and regret written across both faces. I said, I could help you, guide you, but I choose myself. I choose my life. My peace. Emily's hands fell to her sides. You're serious? I nodded. Dead serious. Ryan whispered, I thought we could fix it if we came back to you. I said, fixing it with me isn't the point. The point is I don't belong in the wreckage you created. Emily stepped closer, tears falling. Logan, please. I said firmly, no. I won't go back. I won't be the man who forgives betrayal for comfort. Ryan muttered, then, what now? I said, now you live with it. Now you feel the consequences. I closed the door slowly. Their voices faded into the hall. I leaned against the wood, heart steady, chest calm. I whispered, this is mine now. My life. My rules. I walked to the window, city lights reflecting in the glass. I said aloud, I am free. I am whole. I am stronger than I ever was. Maya Lewis appeared in the doorway. You did it, she said softly. I smiled faintly. I chose me. That's all that matters. She nodded, eyes gentle. You finally won. I said, not against them. Against myself. Against the man I was when I let them control me. Maya smiled. And now? I said, now. I live for me. Calm. Peaceful. Untouchable. The night stretched on, quiet, comforting. I whispered, no regrets. Only forward. Only growth. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of years lift from my chest. I turned from the window and walked toward the soft light of my apartment. I said, the power shift is complete. The past is behind me. The future is mine. For the first time, truly I felt victory, not in revenge, not in anger, but in myself. I whispered, I am finally free. I stood by the window, watching the city glow under the night sky. The silence felt different now, calm, steady, like the world had finally leveled itself. Maya Lewis leaned against the doorframe. Thinking again? I said, always. But this time, it's different. She smiled faintly. Different how? I whispered, because I survived it all. Betrayal, loss, every wound shaped me. Maya nodded. You're not the same man. I said, no. I'm stronger, calmer. I'm finally free. I picked up my wedding ring from the table. I turned it in my fingers, feeling the weight differently now. I once let it bind me, blind to everything else. Now it reminds me of what I endured and what I survived. Maya said softly, "You've earned your peace." I said, "Not earned, claimed." Through pain, clarity, and control. The phone buzzed. A text from Ryan Brooks. "Logan? I understand now." I didn't reply. I whispered, "Understanding is meaningless when it comes too late." Another text from Emily Carter. "I wish I could fix what I broke." I put the phone down. You can't fix a past you destroyed. Only live with it. I walked through the apartment, every step deliberate. Every betrayal taught me something. Every heartbreak, every sleepless night, they forged the man I am now. Maya said, "And who is he?" I said, "A man who trusts wisely, loves cautiously, acts with purpose." I sat at the desk, looking at the photos from better days. Logan Carter speaking to himself quietly, "I loved, I lost, I rebuilt." And I learned that survival isn't just physical, it's emotional, mental, moral. Maya said, "You carry wisdom now." I nodded, "Not just wisdom. Power. The power to choose myself above all else." The city lights reflected in my eyes. I whispered, "Karma didn't strike me. It simply reminded them of their choices." I walked away calm. I let them fall while I rose. Maya said, "It's a rare victory, Logan." I smiled faintly, "The rarest." I poured a glass of water, feeling the cool weight in my hand. Healing isn't instant. It's gradual. Each day I wake, each choice I make, I cement the man I became. Maya asked, "Are you content?" I said, "Content and free. Stronger than yesterday, wiser than ever." I walked back to the window. I was broken. I was betrayed. I was hurt in ways that should have destroyed me. But here I stand. I touched the glass. This city, these nights, this life, it belongs to me now. Maya smiled softly. "You've truly risen above it all." I said, "Not above them. Above myself when I was weak. Above the man I allowed them to create in me." The wind whispered against the window pane. I whispered back, "I am Logan Carter. I endured. I survived. I rebuilt. I am free." Maya said, "And at peace?" I said, "Finally." And the man I became is unshakable. I turned from the window, chest steady, shoulders relaxed. I am whole. I am strong. I am free. The story ends with me. For the first time in years I smiled fully. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. Out of quiet triumph. Out of life reclaimed. I whispered, "This is the man I became."